Hello and welcome to The Road to Autonomy. The Road to Autonomy is brought to you in part by Stantec Generation AV. Stantec Generation AV combines some of the most experienced AV experts in the industry with the resources of a global engineering firm. Stantec Generation AV provides education, consulting, assessment, and guidance to any industry interested in autonomous vehicles. Learn more at stantec.com. Hello and welcome to The Road to Autonomy. I'm your host, Grayson Brulte. On today's episode, we're absolutely honored to welcome John Tully, Vice President of Strategy and Business Development, Pilot Flying J. John, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Great to be here.
I'm excited to have you here because the world's electrifying and companies such as Pilot Flying J are going to play a critical role in our future. Without Pilot Flying J, trucks can't go from point A to B because you play a very critical role in ensuring that the fuel to get there. And John, Bloomberg New Energy Finance is projecting that road fuel demand will peak in 2027. As one of the leading suppliers of fuel, how is Pilot Company ensuring that they can continue to prosper as both commercial and passenger vehicles move towards electrification?
That's an area we're spending a tremendous amount of time, is what the future looks like and how we are an important part of that. And what I would say, first of all, simply stated, our job is to provide the fuel, the amenities for our customers where they want it, which is where our locations are. We've spent decades getting them in the right places, if you will, and when they want it, and that will keep them coming back. So easy to say, a little bit harder to do, and seemingly a lot harder to do going forward as that fuel begins to change. The way, Grayson, that we think about it is, without quibbling over exactly when the peak will be, likely there is a peak in sort of the fuels that we're used to seeing, gasoline and diesel. But I don't think what we're saying there is that demand is going to start going down for products. So not that there will be less cars and trucks on the road, but that the drivetrain that runs them, whether that's electric, hydrogen, or something else, is what's going to come on. So how do we provide everything that's needed when it's needed? And that's really the fun part. So simply stated, again, we're providing the fuel where and when they want it. And the fun part is making sure we're set up to do that. And we've started that journey, and it's going to take a lot of partnerships is really the answer, because what we're talking about is standing up full ecosystems around electric vehicles, around hydrogen vehicles, around different types of renewable diesel. So that's an area that we've been particularly focused on.
Partnerships are key. You mentioned fuel. Most importantly, you provide the fuel for the vehicles, but you provide the fuel for the human driver. You have great coffee and food. You're giving them the fuel they need to get from point A to point B.
Absolutely. We think amenities will continue to be a huge part of this, right? We provide, as you mentioned, the fuel for the driver. We provide other amenities too, like Wi-Fi. Folks don't realize how, for the professional driver, the commercial driver that's on the road 24/7, the additional things that they need available, a place to rest, a place to shower, et cetera. So parking is a big piece of that. So all of that's still going to be needed. Those are all amenities that we provide and are excited to continue to provide. You may have seen that we have a program we're calling New Horizons, where over the next 3 years, we're investing $1 billion in updating and refreshing our stores and improving those amenities for what folks want. By the way, that amount is in addition to, or I should say separate from, the investments we'll be making in the various types of fuels that we were just talking about. So chargers, et cetera.
The chargers, the fueling, they're going to need new infrastructure. How are you approaching this from the infrastructure standpoint? Are you looking strategically at certain Pilot J locations where to put that infrastructure based on demand that you're currently seeing today?
So a couple of things to point out there. Yes, we're focused on where we think it's going to be needed, but this question really underscores the need for partnership. And by partnership, what we mean is we bring, as we just talked about, I think, certain value to the equation, but we're not a power producer. We're not a refiner of fuels. So whether it's the existing fuel that we're used to seeing, where we've made a lot of investments, as have others for the last 100 years, or new fuels, if I can call electric for this discussion purposes new, it's going to take working together to get set up right. And in terms of where we're going to put this, it will a little bit depend on the type of fuel, Grayson. And this is a fun thing to unpack, but our project, as you've seen with GM, we've announced we're going to roll out 2,000 stalls. We're going to do it across 500 stores. And we're starting the conversation in the hardest parts first. And let me say, we're approaching this to try to help answer the as a collective, but Pilot as part of that collective, the range anxiety question. So we're not just doing this where the highest utilization is. We're doing it where we can kind of connect via the corridors, urban areas to urban areas. If you'll allow me, one thing that's different about Pilot from sort of what folks might think of when they think of convenience centers is we are very much along the highways, interstates, freeways, whatever you want to call it from where you're from. And we're less in the key urban areas. So folks that are electric, and let's talk about passenger vehicles first, they can charge at home, they can charge at work, they can charge when they're shopping. But if you're going to grandma's house for Thanksgiving, that's a different journey. And especially if you've got a Chevy e-vehicle, we're looking at, if you're pulling your boat, where are you going to stop and how are you going to get there? And that's part of what we're trying to answer.
It's critical if you're the F-150 Lightning, you're towing a boat, you're going on, say, a bass fishing trip, and you're going to go long distance, let's say 700 miles, 600 miles. You're going to stop at a Pilot and refuel. Because if you look back at the early days of electrification, this is on the passenger vehicle side, it was range anxiety. Oh, I can't buy an electric vehicle. I'm not going to be able to charge it on my way to grandmother's house, or I can't charge it on my fishing trip. We're past the anxiety of range because of the infrastructure. Now we're on to charging anxiety, and I'm calling charging anxiety. When you pull into a Pilot station, your traditional fuel, a gasoline, an 87, 89, or a diesel for your professional drivers, they know it's going to work. Pilot's reliable. When that individual in an electric vehicle or that electric truck pulls in, how do you reinforce the Pilot brand of always being online when they come for electrical charging?
Great question. It was a key part of what we worked on with GM and EVgo. So number one, uptime, which is making sure that when you show up, the infrastructure is working. It's great to say it's there, but if it's there and not working, and I've heard some horrible stats for the industry, that's almost worse than not having it, right? Because people have planned around that as opposed to not. So that is absolutely a key tenet of what we provide now for our customers is, 99 with several nines uptime. And that's, by the way, not to be taken lightly. There's a diesel shortage going on. So it's something what we've put a lot of investment in. We're thinking about the EV space, the charger space the same way. It's part of why we partnered with EVgo to be able to benefit from all the hard work that they've done. And let me say, we're putting in 350s, 350 kilowatt chargers with two hoses with the idea of being able to provide that premium service for our customers to be able to fill the vehicles that can take it. Again, the Hummer, the Silverado, those vehicles that are built for taking that type of charge, we can get them on the road quickly. While that's charging, we've got the Wi-Fi, we've got the other amenities that for the type of journey you were talking about, you're going to need to stop anyway. So let's provide as much of a continued experience to what folks are used to as possible.
You're reinforcing the value of the brand, and that's Mary Barra, Chair and CEO of GM. She stated the following along those lines. We are committed to an all-electric, zero-emissions future, and ensuring that the right charging infrastructure is in place is a key piece of the puzzle. With travel centers across North America, Pilot Company is an ideal collaborator to reach a broad audience of EV drivers. I repeat, Pilot Company is an ideal collaborator to reach a broad audience of EV drivers. Mrs. Barr is correct. You mentioned there's going to be 2,000 charging stalls at 500 locations. When do you expect those to come online as GM is forecasting their EV sales growth?
We're working on it right now. Since that announcement, and frankly, before that announcement, we had been working on it. We're starting in the most difficult places first. I wish we as GM and Pilot had full control, but we have to work with the utilities. And just to give you an example, that first rollout, let's say if we broke it into phases and called the first 253 or 300 stores, let's call that phase one, we're talking about working with over 180 different utilities to get those put in. Okay, because we're looking nationwide, right? We're not saying we're just going to do this in the areas that have the highest utilization. And those utilities range from the biggest ones you would see on the S&P 500 to very small municipal owned or co-op utilities. So it's going to be a journey, and this is where partnerships are super important. But to answer your question directly, we expect to have fences up in end of 1Q, and it will be just a rolling machine from that point on as we move from store to store.
Working with 180 utilities, that's a Herculean task. I got to give your team a lot of credit. That's a big lift.
Let's take the credit after we get it done. Right now, we're sharing that same sentiment, but we're excited to try to tackle it. We're excited to work with them because we know this is something that's part of the future. As you mentioned, GM is super focused on rolling these vehicles out and can tell you that based on they're sold out. So people are buying these vehicles. So we need to be able to service these customers. We want these customers to be our customers.
You want the customers. I think a lot about the road trip, and I've been to several of your travel centers and the way they're designed. I start thinking about, where are you going to put the EV charging infrastructure? Will you put it up front close to the stores? Will you put it in a different part? How are you thinking about where to put the EV charging infrastructure at your travel centers?
It's not going to be the same in every single location, but it will be up front. A little bit depend on the footprint that we have, whether we can set it up, for example, with a canopy for it, which will take more room, but need to be further aside, a little bit based on where the utility lines already are. So not one simple answer, but the guiding light will be what's going to work for the customer.
That has to work. You want to make it convenient. You want them to say, I want to go to Pilot to charge. It's a great, clean experience. The chargers worked. I had a great meal, and away I went. That's what you want at the end of the day. And you have to put in a strategic location where they can go from the vehicle into the restaurant very easily. Do you take that into account of how far that individual might have to walk to use your amenities?
Yes, we do. But so it will be close, but our parking lots are relatively small. So, but to your point, a phrase we say internally is earn the turn. So if someone stops on the way out, we want them to have a good experience and seek us out on the way back.
So you're doing really good work with GM and EVgo building out the charging infrastructure for passenger vehicles. And then on the commercial heavy duty side, you have a partnership with Volvo Group. Volvo is going towards an all-electric future for Class 8 heavy-duty trucks. They're also working on medium heavy-duty trucks as well. Could you talk about the partnership with the Volvo Group, please?
Yeah, super exciting. We're working with Volvo to begin to, as you say, roll out for the medium and heavy duty what we're doing for the passenger vehicles. We've got a little bit more time in that the trucks are further back from where the passenger vehicles are, but our anticipation is that you've got commercial fleets that are going to be buying these EV vehicles. So there are some locations where they're going to be required to. Certain West Coast ports are starting to require that. But if we set that aside for a moment, we expect that fleets will begin to adopt when it makes sense commercially. Now, there'll be incentives in certain states, and that will help guide us where we go there. But my main point is, unlike passenger vehicles where it's a household by household decision, here you're having fleet level decisions, and that can really move a needle quickly. And the hard part for us to figure out now is the use cases that are relevant for Pilot, right? So if you've got vans for a particular retailer that go out and back and fuel there, they might, need us in emergencies, but it's really the longer range vehicles that are going to need us where they can't quite get there in a destination. And there's still a fair amount to be figured out with trucks in terms of how far they can go, right? How hard the wind is blowing matters. There's the obvious stuff that folks are used to. It's cold, it's mountainous, but wind resistance on a truck is a real thing. And that can have an impact. So it's a bit of a use case discussion. Volvo's, we're super excited to begin working with them to set this up. But let me point out that like with GM, what we're setting up is available for everybody. It takes a partnership to get it going. It takes some forward thinking. But what we're trying to do is set up an ecosystem that works for all of our customers.
And that's why you succeed, because it works for everybody.
I hope so.
We had the Tesla announcement of the semi 500 miles. If you mentioned wind, if you go from Los Angeles to Las Vegas, a heavily trafficked route for truck traffic, those winds out in Barstow, they blow. They get pretty intense, and that will limit the range. When you're looking at putting in the heavy-duty infrastructure for Class 8 trucks and Class 6 trucks, do you consult or speak to your fleet customers that are really good with Pilot and say, okay, customer A, okay, customer B, how are you thinking about electrification? Where do you think of rolling it out so we can ensure that Pilot's there for you when you're ready to make that decision and convert to electric?
Yes, absolutely. Though, let me say that like Pilot, the crystal ball is not so crystal clear. It becomes a bit easier if you're a fleet that goes in and out of a port in California, in Southern California, where it's required. And that requirement is on its way, and you've got a limited window. So some of that's a bit obvious as to where to start. It's on the corridors in California. But how it grows out from there and what those use cases are, that's where we'll have to kind of collectively lean in.
We're going to have a breakthrough. If the professional drivers that go over the road, they need more than 500 miles. With the diesel, they can go 2,000 miles. They're going to have to get the range up. We all agree that the electrification for Class 8 will start in California, most likely the Port of LA, San Pedro, Long Beach in that area, and then probably work its way towards Arizona, since that is a major trucking route, or up towards Sacramento. When do you expect to see the battery electric Class 8 trucks beginning to show up at your travel centers? Have you designated called a pilot innovation center where you're going to prototype and experiment with a partner? Or when do you start to see the first battery electric Class 8 trucks coming online at pilot locations?
We're trying to get our hands, so we run a fleet of 1,500 trucks ourselves. So we're trying to get our hands on one in the next year. My understanding is that there are Class 6s available now, but they're not kind of being manufactured at scale, and that's more of a mid-decade, call it 2025 and out before, so they'll start coming on in the thousands in the next couple of years, we anticipate. But I suspect that a lot of those initially are going to be based, home-based vehicles that are out and back. I'm speculating here, and this is just me talking. I'm going to say 24, 25 is when we'll start seeing onesie twosies on the road looking for a place like Pilot. So that doesn't leave us a lot of time to get these set up. Now, are we going to build out an infrastructure for 2 vehicles? No, but the vehicles will quickly follow. So mid to late decade, we need to be set up. In the area you were just talking about, California, it takes a couple of years, especially if you start thinking about, now, again, I mentioned 350 kilowatt chargers. That's as robust as you can get today. Folks are talking about 1 megawatt chargers. I don't know how realistic that is, but it's an easy math to use, right? If you've got 5 trucks coming in, a 5 megawatt pull is a substantial discussion with your utility. And by the way, down the road, as if this really becomes a replacement for diesel, we have a lot more than 5 trucks fueling at a time, right? So you begin to talk about needing mini power plants at each location, and we're 20% of the on-road diesel demand. But when you play that out in terms of power, it is a very substantial power pull that we'll need. And we're back to our partnership discussion again there.
You're going to need a lot of energy. You mentioned the timeline. The other aspect that's not discussed a lot is the permitting process. If you're going to put that amount of energy, you have to go through a very long, sometimes complex permitting process.
Especially if we're talking about significant volume.
Will you have to update the infrastructure for all this energy? If you're going to put a mini power plant, a microgrid, how much overhaul are you going to have to do to your infrastructure to support this?
Great question. So let me be clear. We're not looking at putting in mini power plants. It's just an example of the power pull that will be needed. We need to work with the local utilities. And by the way, most folks, when the road to electrification in their mind includes green power, right? So we haven't even begun to tackle that in this conversation. And let's not, because I do think, batteries will be a part of it. And that technology seems to be continuing to evolve. And we'll pull it in when it becomes clear that investment makes sense, either from a support or cost perspective for our customers. And we're not quite there yet, but that's something we're looking at. As I mentioned, we're trying to roll out at 500 stores back if we just focus on the passenger vehicles. In order to get that out in a time frame that makes sense for our partners and for our customers, we're probably not going to get every location perfect in terms of what would make the ultimate sense if you were only working on one location. We'll learn as we go and build it from there.
But you're leaning into the future. That's the bottom line. Pilot's leaning into the future. You have the 1,500 truck fleet. You're looking at electrifying that fleet. It's the old Google analogy, eat your own dog food. You want to learn to understand the technology. That will allow you, in my opinion, to provide a better service to your customers because you're leaning into the future.
We're trying to do it in a way where, we don't know enough about what our customers' needs are going to be in the future to just grab the banners and start marching in a direction and expect that we'll be right. So we're trying to do it in a way that's leading, but in a way that's measured so that if it turns out that hydrogen becomes a lot more significant, that we're working on that too. Our locations are large, right? They average 10 acres. It's still not enough with the demands that we have for parking and for other amenities to be able to provide every fuel at every location at scale. So that's what we're needing to work through. And I'm maybe ranging a bit from what you were asking, but in terms of leaning towards the future, it's really how do we, again, try to be where our customers want us to be, and we're trying to be just a half step ahead of them so that we actually have time to set it up so that it's there when they need it.
You're leaning into the future on energy. You're also leaning into the future on autonomous trucking. Pilot invested in Kodiak Robotics, and you took a board seat. What did you see in Kodiak that you decided to make the decision to make the investment in Kodiak?
Kodiak specifically, we saw a great culture. We saw a culture that aligned with the way that we think about and see the world. So we were excited to learn from them and try to, as you said, try to lean into the future with Kodiak. it's a great team, and we're happy to be working with them.
It's a wonderful culture. Don Burnett, their CEO, has done a phenomenal job. Jordan, their general counsel, he's done a job. Dan running all the policy. And Andreas, their CTO. The one thing I like about Kodiak, every time you meet an individual that works at Kodiak, Brett, for example, came on, they're very nice and polite. You hit the nail on the head. They have a wonderful, I'll use the word, a humble, appreciative culture. And that's what's going to allow them to succeed. You're on the board of Kodiak. What are you hoping to achieve during your board tenure?
A couple things. One, to be helpful, to provide a voice that might not otherwise exist in Silicon Valley as to what we're thinking about and what the customers are thinking about. Now, they've got their own ability to talk with fleets, of course, but there's a significant piece of the puzzle when you think about autonomous trucks as to where and when they stop and what happens when they stop, and how we work together to allow Pilot to provide those amenities for what our customers want is important to us. And again, it goes back to where we started, is what do our customers want? We do think that autonomous trucking is solving a real problem that exists. We do think it's something that lives alongside our existing fleet customers and the drivers. Our drivers are super core to us. So it's how do we continue to provide and improve what we're doing for our drivers, while also looking ahead and seeing where our customers are headed and make sure that we can provide part of those solutions for the autonomous world as well.
It's a very balanced approach. I'll say this, professional drivers are rock stars. They're incredible individuals, million milers, multi-million milers with no crashes. There's some phenomenal drivers that they keep our goods. They stock our Costco's. They stock our grocery stores because they go out there and they sacrifice to the long haul professional drivers. Thank you for your service and doing that, especially during the depths of the pandemic. If it wasn't for you, we wouldn't have toilet paper and we wouldn't have Bounty. You play a really big role in this. You want to be helpful to Kodiak. That is a very good thing. And when you look at autonomous trucking, there's a general consensus in the market that it's going to go hub to hub, or if you want to use the term, depot to depot. Pilot has really vast experience running travel centers. How do you imagine it's called the autonomous trucking depot of the future looking? Will it be a dedicated piece of real estate somewhere that Pilot perhaps can operate, or will it be adjacent to a traditional travel center?
That's exactly what we're trying to figure out. And I hope, let me put it that way, this is just me talking, I hope we can figure out in a way that's adjacent, because as we've talked about, and you had been kind to point out, there's some great amenities that are already there. And if we're going depot to depot, I think the implication there is that, at least in that instance, there's drivers that are doing the first mile, last mile through some of the more tangled areas. And those drivers are still going to need their fuel, a lounge, a place to be, internet access, bathrooms, 24/7 lit, safe areas. So we'd like to think that we can lean on what we're providing for drivers now and continue to provide that, but at the same time have an area that can be where an autonomous vehicle can safely pilot in and get refueled and get the light maintenance that it needs. That would be the ideal, but we're early days to see what we can build out.
Is the truck port that you're developing with Kodiak in Atlanta, it's called the innovation site, the test site, where you can take all of your vast experience with travel centers and the team at Kodiak can take their vast autonomous experience and combine it together to experiment?
Yes, that's the intention. I think Kodiak has a very clear vision as to what they're going to need, and we're going to work together to make sure that it's something that we can provide safely and securely that optimizes across these many different variables that we're talking about.
There's a common denominator. You're leaning into innovation. You're working on energy. You're working on autonomy. What is your long-term strategy for fueling life's journeys? Is it going where your customer goes, or is this, how are you going to always ensure that Pilot will always continue to innovate throughout the future?
Great question. And the short answer is yes. There could be no better compass than our customers, right? So if our customers are happy, we'll do just fine. And so that's the intention. The hard part is, look, if in travel center world, there's at least on the fueling side, there hasn't been a tremendous amount of innovation over the last many decades, right? You've got the introduction of DEF, or on the gasoline side, maybe you've got slightly higher octane. You got to go all the way back to unleaded, in my view, leaded versus unleaded, to talk about when there was a meaningful change. Now, there's been ethanol and there's renewable diesel, and we are absolutely one of the biggest providers of biodiesel and renewable diesel, but that's pretty transparent from the driver's perspective, as opposed to switching to a hydrogen vehicle or an electric vehicle where the full supply chain needs to get built out in a different way. The lift there just across the whole ecosystem really requires one to lean in and raise your hand and say, hey, we want to be part of the solution, and find others in the space like GM, like some of the others we mentioned, that want to solve that. And in the case of autonomous, of course, away from fuels like Kodiak.
With renewable diesel, does that use the existing infrastructure you have, or did you have to put new infrastructure in place to be able to serve that to your customers?
Yeah, it uses the existing, and like biodiesel, renewable diesel can use the existing infrastructure. It just needs to be labeled appropriately. So it doesn't require a different build out. It does require a different supply chain because it needs to be kept separate in order to be able to label it, right? So even though renewable diesel is molecularly the same thing as fossil-based diesel, we track it separately from the source, the refiner that provides the renewable diesel, whether that's with used cooking oil or whatever feedstock they use, and we track that fully separately to provide it into our pumps. And we expect next year to have all of our diesel in California to be renewable or biodiesel.
Go Pilot Flying J. Well done. So next year, you have all renewable diesel in California. How are your fleet customers? Are they using the renewable diesel, or what has the reaction been from your fleet customers?
Yes, I think there's still, in some cases, some education happening where folks are learning that renewable diesel is not the same thing as biodiesel, which is molecularly different and needs to be, managed a bit differently. And I'm no chem engineer, so we probably shouldn't go a whole lot further than that. But suffice it to say that it doesn't have an impact in the performance of the vehicle. And it's something that I think, given that we're really talking about California, because that's where the demand for the fuel is, that would look for it to grow out from there. But first our retail, and then, wholesale and other customers.
Well, you're not a chemical scientist. You're clearly a strategist. You're clearly leading Pilot Flying J into the future. You're embracing new forms of energy. You're embracing the future of autonomous trucking. And John, I've learned a lot throughout this conversation. And what would you like our listeners to take away with them today?
It's been a great conversation, and I really appreciate it. For the listeners, you said it best yourself. We're really focused on our customers, and that's predominantly the professional driver. It's also the family. So anything that your listeners, if they're customers of ours, we love it. We're trying to make sure that you keep coming back and welcome any kind of feedback as we head down this journey. I feel very lucky and blessed to work here. It's a great ownership that has really leaned in and tried to, not just on this, but across a whole number of things, really try to put the customer first and make sure that we're doing the best we can. So thank you.
You're very welcome. You're clearly putting the customer first, John. To our listeners that are perhaps going on a long road trip over the holidays or a spring break, if you've never stopped at a Pilot Flying J, stop there. The gas is reliable. The service is excellent. You have amenities. You have fuel for yourself and food and coffee. And Pilot Flying J is an extremely well-run company, because the future is bright, the future is autonomous, and the future is Pilot Flying J. John, thank you so much for coming on the Road to Autonomy today.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Road to Autonomy podcast. If you've enjoyed listening, please rate, review, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Want to get in touch? Follow us on Twitter at Road to Autonomy, or email podcast@brulteco.com. The Road to Autonomy is produced by Brulte & Company. The views and opinions expressed on the Road to Autonomy podcast do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of Brulte & Company. The content discussed on this podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be taken as legal, tax, investment, or business advice.